A reading from the Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, according to Mark. Glory to you, Lord Christ. As he taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you.
You may be seated. Christ is risen. I can't remember who it was that said, "I am neither an optimist nor a pessimist. Christ is risen from the dead." I think that's a good word for all of us today. I'm neither an optimist nor a pessimist. Christ is risen from the dead. I'm not exactly sure what I'm trying to say today, and so I'm just going to get into it, and we'll see where we end up. At the ground floor of Christian belief, of Christian living, there's this basic idea that we need to know who and what we can trust. Last week, for All Saints' Day, we talked about how the saints are the ones from whom we draw strength and courage and nourishment, trustworthy lives, we said. And today, in the stories that we're given in the lectionary, we're reminded that not only is faith about drawing strength and trust from other people, but our lives are called to be a source of trust and strength for others. The first story that we encounter today in our lectionary text is a story out of the book of Ruth. If you're not familiar with Ruth, it's a short book. It's only 4 chapters, so you might want to read them in case you bump into Ruth in the life that is to come. It opens with this woman named Naomi. She's an Israelite woman who has lost everything. There's a severe famine in the land, and her family, they've moved from Bethlehem to Moab, the pagan land of Moab, which is how you know that these were desperate times, because Moab is an ancient enemy of Israel. This is not a move that any Israelite would have chosen for themselves, to move to Moab if things were not desperate. So, Naomi, her husband, her 2 sons, they arrive in Moab. The 2 sons get married. They find wives who had no men in her world. Meant that she had nothing. She had no legal rights. She had no identity. And the understanding in this ancient culture was that the woman's glory was found in her sons, her family's ability to sustain itself, to grow the family tree, as it were. And so Naomi had not just lost these precious people to her, not just lost her identity, not just lost her legal rights, she had lost her glory. This meant Naomi would have to live a life of powerlessness, a life of destitution, without agency. Thank God for the ongoing liberation of women in our day. May it continue. So early in the story, Naomi chooses to return to her homeland in Israel and not stay in Moab. So she tells both of her daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, go back to your mother's home," she says. "May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me." One of the daughter-in-laws, her name is Orpah, not Oprah, Orpah. She goes back to Moab. She does what Naomi invites her to do, goes back to her mother's house. But Ruth, the text says, clings to Naomi. saying to her that famous line that we see in the scriptures, "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people shall become my people, and your God, my God." So, Naomi and Ruth head to Israel together. But remember, Ruth is not an Israelite. She is a Moabitess, an outsider to the story of God's people. The Moabites were oftentimes the bad guys in the Bible, which meant just showing up in Israel would mean facing being shunned and being rejected. For those of you old enough to remember the weeks and the months post 9/11, we saw something of this in our world, right? Where there was a shunning and a rejection of the Arabs in our midst, the people from the Middle East that didn't quite look like us. We've heard more recently of things like Muslim bans on our country. This is not an unusual or a foreign idea to us of having an outsider being shunned and rejected and turned away. But still, Ruth embraces the role of being Naomi's daughter. And even though she's an immigrant, even though she's an outsider to God's people, she becomes an example of God's faithfulness through her loyalty to Naomi. It's interesting, throughout this story, if you go and read it today, God is never mentioned by the narrator. The narrator never once mentions God's activity, God's action, God's desire. Everything that we know about God in this story, it comes through the activity of these normal, everyday people who are going about doing normal, everyday kind of things, marrying and burying, moving, traveling, figuring out what to eat. Naomi and Ruth, they come back to Bethlehem and they have no protection, they have no money, and they have no food. Remember, this is a time of severe famine in the land. So the text says that Ruth goes out to glean behind the reapers, which is to say she followed behind those people who were gathering the harvest. And anything that was dropped and left behind, she would pick up. Like scraps from the table, she would take whatever she could find. And it turns out that this guy, Boaz, who owns the land, he sees her. And what do you know? He's heard about her story, about the way that she remained loyal, about the way that she remained faithful to Naomi in the midst of this tragedy of famine and death. So Boaz tells her, hey, don't just pick up the scraps. Don't just pick up whatever is left behind. Pick from the full harvest, he tells her. When you're thirsty, drink from the water that my men pull from the well. When you are hungry, come and eat with us. Here's Ruth's response. This is Ruth chapter 3, beginning in verse 10. Then she fell prostrate with her face to the ground and said to him, why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me when I am a foreigner? But Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me. And how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. Shortly after this moment, Boaz makes the choice to marry Ruth. And this is the first time in all the biblical text where we see a woman referred to in this way, Eshet Shayil, he says to her, woman of valor. This is the language that we see in Proverbs 31. But he doesn't just refer to her as a woman of valor. He says another thing to her. He says, the full assembly of my people will know that you are a woman of valor. The full assembly of my people will know. So somehow the faithfulness of Ruth to Naomi Her boldness in returning to a land where she had no promise and no security, where she was seen as an outsider, as worthless. Because of Ruth's loyalty and because of Boaz's generosity, Naomi is restored and blessed. This is what we find in the story of Ruth, the interplay of God's purpose and human decisions. Again, we never hear about what God wants. We never hear about God's activity from the narrator, of God pulling any strings behind the scenes. All that we know of God happens through the choices of everyday human beings. This story shows us that God's will be realized. But for whatever reason, God has determined that his will, his purpose in the world, it will be realized not by dominance, not by violating our personhood or our agency, but through participation, through human activity, human choices, human faithfulness, through people whose lives take responsibility for God's believability. Let's turn our attention briefly to the gospel reading for today. It's a story that we're likely familiar with. Jesus is telling us to beware of the rich, those who take advantage of the most vulnerable. They devour widows, the text says. They devour widows' houses and say long prayers for the sake of appearance. Interestingly enough, one of the primary concerns of the early church was the care of the widows. So much so that in the first couple of centuries of the church, Christianity was ridiculed by pagan rulers as being a pathetic religion of slaves, women, and children. Slaves, women, and children. So Jesus says, beware of these people who devour widows' houses. And then the story draws our attention to the many rich people who are putting money into the temple treasury. But this poor widow, Jesus says, puts in everything that she has, these 2 copper coins. If you're someone who's interested in what that looks like in today's currency, the closest equivalent that we have is that these 2 copper coins would be about 1/64th of a day's wages. So whatever you need to live on in one day, this constitutes 1/64th of that. Still, Jesus tells us that she has put in more than all those who contributed. So what's happening here? I think it's more than just a comparison thing, which is how we usually hear something like the rich gave out of their abundance, but she gave out of her poverty, gave all that she had, everything that she had. I think it's not just that by comparison, she gave more than they did. I think something more interesting is happening here. Remember, in Ruth, we don't get any arguments for God's existence. We don't get any arguments for God's activity. It's by these normal, everyday, faithful actions of human beings that God's believability begins to come into focus. Somehow, Ruth's faithfulness makes the faith of other people possible. Ruth's loyalty restores people like Naomi. And here in this story of the poor widow, we should ask ourselves, who stirs up faith in me? The rich can put in large sums, but there's no faith involved. I'm not moved to faithfulness, to generosity, to loyalty when I see the rich doing what rich people do. The rich have a future that is secure. They give, but there's no uncertainty about what the day will bring. Will they have enough? But what this woman gives isn't just her money, but her sense of security. Any chance of securing even a moment of her future for herself, that is faith. This woman's gift is more important not because of what it costs her, but because of what it produces in other people. Her sacrifice makes me wonder, what sacrifices have I made to make the community of faith more recognizable in the world? Her generosity causes generosity to well up in me, Somehow, her faithfulness makes faith possible for me. I can only hope to have faith in that way. Here's the point. If people are going to come to believe in Jesus, it won't be because they have had, maybe not, it probably won't be, because they've had some kind of bodily encounter with the resurrected Christ. Wonderful if that's how it happens. Probably not going to happen that way. If people are going to come to believe in Jesus, to trust him, to trust his church, it will be through the faithfulness of normal, everyday people like you and me who take responsibility for God's believability. It will be our faithfulness. It will be our generosity, our loyalty to Jesus and to others that will stir up faithfulness, that will stir up generosity, that will stir up hope in other people. Etty Hillesum, she was a young woman in her 20s when Nazi Germany occupied Holland. And she watched her whole world turn into a nightmare in a matter of weeks and months. She was eventually sent to a concentration camp at Westbrook before she was shipped to the gas chambers at Auschwitz. And she wrote in her diary, she said this, "There must be someone to live through it all and bear witness to the fact that God lived, even in these times. And why should I not be that witness? There must be someone to live through it all and bear witness to the fact that God lived." Rowan Williams describes her attitude and her commitment like this. She decided to occupy a certain place in the world, a place where others could somehow connect with God through her. She took responsibility for making God credible in the world. What is he saying? What we've said again and again this morning. Etty took responsibility for God's believability. Normal, everyday people being faithful to what is right in front of them. That's the thing that makes God believable. That's the thing that makes believing in Jesus possible for other people. Philosopher Jacques Ellul tells us, we are free to live wise, caring lives. The Spirit liberates us from every bondage and puts us in a situation of freedom, choice, open possibilities. The Spirit enlivens our conscience, allowing us to discern God's will, preventing us from taking refuge in ignorance. The Spirit makes us fully responsible. As we find ourselves more deeply in communion with God, what we realize is that we are not freed from responsibility in the world. We are pressed into responsibility by the Spirit. Responsibility for ourselves, responsibility for our neighbors, responsibility for making God believable in a world where it's hard to see the will and the purposes of God being realized. 1947, another French guy, Albert Camus, he wrote a novel called The Plague that follows the story of this doctor in this little coastal city of Iran during a time of plague and pestilence. And through a major section of the book, everyone just kind of ignores what's happening, ignores the plague. It doesn't draw too much attention because at first it only affects the rats. And then all the rats start to die. And then a few people start getting sick until eventually the plague takes over the whole city and they lock the gates. So the plague then becomes embedded in the fabric of their daily existence, their daily lives. You might not even notice it until it comes to your attention, he witnesses. So Camus is saying that fighting the plague, fighting the pestilence, it becomes all the more important because it becomes so routine. It becomes so everyday that you don't even realize the kind of pain and suffering that it's bringing to your neighbors' lives. For Camus, the plague becomes this great metaphor for Nazism and fascism because it insinuates itself into every dimension of life, and you can find some way to avoid responsibility. That obviously is what happened. The major point of the book is that we can hide inside of the social structures that make it possible for us to ignore responsibility, to ignore what is required for us to become human in the most real sense, to care about human need and suffering, to take responsibility for God's believability in a world of pain and darkness. There's one character in this book that I'm so captured by. His name is Rambert, and he's this writer. And when the plague first takes over the city, he tries everything that he can to get out because he's not from there. He doesn't live in Oran. He was visiting when they locked the gates. And he talks about his love who's back in France and how he has to get back to her. And if he doesn't get back to her, she might just move on to some other guy. He has a life to live outside of this city that's been plagued by this pestilence. So he's trying to bribe guards. He's trying to find little ways to escape the city. And finally, he comes to a moment where he can leave. And he has a choice to make. He has a decision. And in that moment, when he could have escaped, when he could have gotten away from it all, he decides to stay. The story says that he decides to take responsibility and do what he can to fight the plague. Here's what I'm trying to say. You may or may not feel like there's much good in the world right now, but the goodness that you show to your neighbor just might make God's goodness believable. You may not feel like there is much kindness in the world right now, but the kindness that you show to your kids, to your coworkers, to your family, to your friends, just might make God's kindness believable. Your love, your hospitality, your faithfulness, it just might make God's love and hospitality and faithfulness believable to people who cannot see it right now. Fleming Rutledge reminds us of this. She says, when you reach out your hand to another, it is the hand of God. When you are faithful to your spouse, it is the faithfulness of God. When an employer cares for his workforce, it is the care of God. When comfort and protection are offered to a stranger or a foreigner or an outsider of any kind, it is the protection and comfort and help of the Lord himself. His covenant love appears in human form in the flesh. Does this mean everywhere you go and everyone you meet is just going to burst at the seams with love for God and love for neighbor? Probably not. The point is, you don't know who's looking. You don't know who's wondering if God's believability is reliable, if it's trustworthy. You don't know what small act of faith, of loyalty, of generosity might just stoke the embers of faith in someone else. At the end of Ruth, we find this genealogy that is produced, that's made possible as a result of Ruth's faithfulness and Boaz's generosity. Ruth and Boaz have a son whose name is Obed, and this begins the restoration of Naomi's glory. Ruth and Boaz have a son named Obed. Then Obed becomes the father of Jesse, and Jesse becomes the father of David. This is how the book of Ruth ends, with the name of David, by naming this one who would become the king of Israel. And while the book of Ruth ends with a genealogy, Matthew's gospel opens with the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David. Abraham fathered Isaac, it says. Isaac fathered Jacob. Jacob fathered Judah. Judah fathered Perez and Zerah, Hezron, Ram, Aminadab, Nahshon, Salmon, Rahab, Ruth, Jesse fathered David the king, and on until we read these words. Jacob fathered Joseph, the husband of Mary, by whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. At the beginning of the Gospels, what we see is that the faithfulness of an outsider, a Moabite woman, an enemy of the people of God, finds her place in the royal family tree of Jesus. Why does all that matter? You don't know what simple act of faithfulness might be responsible for someone having an encounter with Jesus, might be responsible for God's believability. Maybe it will be an act like Ruth, committing to stay, to cling to a people in spite of your own uncertainty about the future. Maybe it's an act like Naomi, who cares for this outsider, this Moabite girl, bringing her back to her hometown, knowing that she, Naomi, is going to be associated with this Moabite woman. You know, we've often said here at Sanctuary that we are committed to following Jesus no matter who it associates us with or separates us from. We're committed to following Jesus. Maybe it's an act like that widow who places the very prospect of a future into God's hands. I don't know what it will look like, but I do know that what God means for us is to live our lives of faith in such a way as to make other people's faith possible. In just a few weeks, we're going to turn the page on another year and step into the season of Advent. Advent, it gets a little distorted because it leads to this cheery, bright, joyful moment of Christmas Day. But Advent, if it's about anything, it's about people immersed in darkness who are still awake to the coming light. And it's that testifying to the light. It's testifying to the good, the true, the beautiful. It's testifying to faith, hope, and love. That testifying that can bring others from that darkness into the light. We are people who see in the dark. You may not see a lot of light in the world right now. We are people who see in the dark. And we allow the light of Christ to shine in us so that others can see the eternal world of God's kingdom. So be faithful. Be faithful. You don't know who might need your faithfulness. And here's the good news. 2 Timothy 2:13 tells us, even if we are faithless, he is faithful, for he cannot deny himself. He remains faithful. Amen.